Why was everyone so quiet when she walked into the briefing room? The hum of conversation died instantly, chairs shifted, papers stilled. She felt the weight of eyes on her shoulders as though her very presence was an intrusion. Emily Carter stood straighter, refusing to show the tremor in her chest. Her uniform was pressed, her salute sharp, but none of that seemed to matter here. Not in this place where tradition was heavier than truth, where respect was rationed like scarce ammunition. She had thought it would feel different. Becoming an officer, earning the rank she had fought for, these were supposed to be moments of pride, not silence. Her father had cried the day she graduated officer candidate school. Her mother, tired from another night shift at the hospital, had held her face in her hands and whispered, "You're stronger than you think." But here, in the sterile air of the base, strength felt like a test she hadn't studied for. At the head of the table, Colonel Briggs shifted in his chair. The lines of his face were carved deep with years of command, but his expression was one of irritation, not pride. His lips curled as if the sight of her was a disruption he couldn't tolerate. He didn't need to speak for everyone to understand what he thought. They had seen the way he looked at her in previous briefings, the way his dismissive chuckle undercut her every suggestion. To him, her presence was an error the system had made, one he intended to correct, one way or another. Emily kept her voice steady when she gave her update. Logistics, movement reports, nothing dramatic, nothing controversial. She had rehearsed every word, trimming her sentences down to facts, facts no one could dispute. Still, the colonel smirked, rolling a pen between his fingers. When she finished, he didn't thank her, didn't nod, didn't even glance at her papers. He just tapped the pen against the table once, a dismissive click, and turned to the captain on his right as though Emily's existence had already been erased. But there was something she hadn't told them. Not yet. Something that kept her awake at night. She felt it under her skin, a weight pressing against her ribs. She had joined the military to prove herself, but already she was beginning to understand that battles weren't just fought in deserts or jungles. Some of the fiercest battles happened in quiet rooms, with silence as sharp as shrapnel. When the briefing ended, chairs scraped the floor. Officers filed out in pairs, voices rising again now that the colonel had stood and left. Emily lingered, collecting her notes. She caught a few glances, some pitying, some wary, none supportive. Respect was a currency here, and no one wanted to spend it on her. Not yet. As she walked the corridor back to her quarters, her boots striking rhythm against the tile, she remembered the first time she had set foot on this base. The gates had opened wide, the American flag snapping in the wind above her. She had felt a swell in her chest then, the kind of pride that made her believe she could endure anything. She had been wrong about many things, but not about her own resolve. The harder they pressed, the harder she would push back. That was the promise she made to herself, though no one else would hear it. In the evenings, when the noise of the day quieted and the barracks grew still, Emily would sit on the edge of her bed, polishing her boots until she could see her reflection. She thought of her parents back home, of her father's rough hands on the steering wheel of his truck, of her mother's tired smile after 12-hour shifts. They hadn't raised her to crumble. They hadn't raised her to be ordinary. Every stitch in her uniform felt like a stitch in the fabric of their sacrifice. To quit, to falter, would mean dishonoring them, and that she could never do. Still, the loneliness gnawed. She wasn't naive enough to expect instant acceptance, but she hadn't expected open disdain either. Every slight glance, every snicker behind her back, every correction barked louder than necessary. It was like erosion, slow but relentless. At night she prayed quietly, not for an easier path, but for the strength to walk the one before her. The moment that would change everything came without warning. A summons slipped under her door, her presence requested in Colonel Briggs' office. No reason stated, no explanation, just a time, just a command. She stared at the paper, her pulse quickening. She tried to imagine what he wanted. Another lecture about discipline, a scolding disguised as mentorship, or perhaps just another chance to remind her she didn't belong. She prepared herself carefully, uniform crisp, hair tied back neatly. She rehearsed her responses, short, respectful, controlled. She wouldn't give him any reason to twist her words. She would endure whatever he threw at her, then walk out with her dignity intact. When she entered his office, the colonel didn't look up right away. Papers were spread across his desk, but his attention wasn't on them. He sat back slowly, eyes narrowing as though measuring her resolve. The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. "Lieutenant Carter," he said finally, his voice dripping with contempt, "do you think you belong here?" Emily kept her eyes steady. "Sir, I've earned my place." His laugh was sharp, cruel. "You earned nothing. You were handed this because someone thought it was time to parade equality through the ranks. But let's be honest, you don't belong. Not here, not in my command." The words cut, but Emily stood unmoving. She had known this was coming. She had known he would attack, one way or another. What she didn't expect was what happened next. The colonel rose from his chair, stepping closer. His shadow fell across her boots. "You think you're one of us because you wear that uniform." His voice lowered, a hiss meant only for her. "You're a joke, and I'll show you just how much of a joke you are." Before she could respond, before she could even move, his hand clamped around her arm. The grip was iron, bruising. He dragged her across the office, out the door, down the short hall to the restroom. The sound of his boots echoed like gunfire in her ears. She stumbled once, caught herself, forced her chin high even as dread twisted her stomach. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and unflattering. The colonel shoved her forward, the stall door clanging against the wall. For a heartbeat she thought, hoped, it was just another intimidation tactic. But then his hand pressed hard against the back of her neck, and in one merciless motion, he forced her head down. The water was icy, shocking. It filled her ears, her nose, her mouth. Panic surged, her body thrashing against the hold. The humiliation stung deeper than the water's burn. She pulled herself up gasping, hair plastered to her face, lungs aching. For a split second she thought she might collapse, might scream, might let the tears fall. But she didn't. She straightened, dripping, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. She turned to him slowly, eyes burning not with tears but with a fire she hadn't known she carried. Her voice came out calm, steady, stronger than she felt inside. "Colonel," she said, every word deliberate, "you've just disgraced not me, but the uniform you wear, and every soldier under your command will remember this moment, not as my humiliation but as your shame." Silence, he froze, his hand falling back to his side. For the first time his confidence faltered. Her words hung in the air, heavy as judgment. Emily didn't slam the door when she left. She didn't shout. She didn't cry until she was alone in her room later that night. She walked through the corridors with water dripping down her uniform, her boots squelching softly against the floor while soldiers watched in stunned silence. None spoke, none moved, but all of them saw. And word would spread, word always spread. She stood alone in her room, hands trembling as she peeled off her soaked uniform. The fabric clung to her skin like a second layer of shame. She sat heavily on the edge of her bed, her hair dripping onto the floor, her chest heaving with the echo of what had just happened. She pressed her palms against her knees, willing her body to stop shaking. But the tremors weren't just from the cold. They were from something deeper, something that had lodged itself inside her, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and sorrow. Why had no one stopped him? She replayed the hallway in her mind, the soldiers who had looked on, eyes wide, lips pressed shut. Fear had locked them in place. She didn't blame them, not entirely. Briggs was a colonel, a man of rank, power, influence. But still, the silence of others was sometimes the sharpest wound. She had learned that lesson young, when teachers ignored the bullies, when neighbors turned away from fights at the playground. But she had hoped, prayed that in the military, where honor was supposed to mean something, things would be different. That night the tears finally came. Not loud, not violent. Just quiet streams rolling down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. She didn't cry for herself, not really. She cried for the uniform, for the weight it was supposed to carry, for the soldiers who deserved leaders they could trust. She cried because she knew what he had done wasn't just an attack on her dignity. It was a fracture in the very foundation of command. But after the tears, something steadier surfaced. A decision. She sat at her desk, opened a notebook, and began to write. Every detail, every word spoken, every second of what had happened. She wrote it not as vengeance, but as record. Her hands shook at first, but the more she wrote, the steadier she became. By the time she signed her name at the bottom, her pen moved with certainty. This wasn't revenge. This was truth. And truth was the one weapon he could not take from her. Still, doubt whispered. Would anyone believe her? Would the witnesses speak up, or would they remain silent out of fear? Would her report vanish into some drawer buried under red tape? She folded the pages carefully, slid them into an envelope, and sealed it with a breath that carried both fear and faith. She knew once it left her hands, there would be no turning back. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every second in her mind. The weight of the humiliation pressed against her chest, but stronger than that was the question. What would they do with her truth? Would it be enough to topple a man who had built his career on intimidation and tradition? Or would she be cast aside, branded as trouble, dismissed before her story could take root? By morning, whispers already spread through the base. Soldiers moved differently around her, their conversations halting when she passed. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with caution. And some, she knew, with admiration they dared not voice aloud. She carried herself as though nothing had happened, shoulders squared, chin lifted. But inside, the memory burned. Every step was a reminder of the water in her lungs, the shame in her veins, and the strength she had summoned in that single moment of defiance. When she turned in her report, the captain who received it didn't look at her directly. He glanced at the envelope, then at her face, and nodded stiffly. No words were exchanged, but she saw the flicker in his eyes, the recognition that this was more than paperwork. This was a grenade rolled onto the floor of command, and sooner or later it would explode. The investigation began quietly, almost invisibly. Officers spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors. Witnesses were called in one by one. Some tried to dodge, tried to soften their accounts, but too many had seen. Too many had heard. And Emily's written testimony was steady, clear, undeniable. Briggs, for all his bluster, could not erase what had happened. He tried, of course. He claimed it had been a lesson in toughness, a demonstration of discipline. But the words sounded hollow, desperate. The colonel who had once commanded with iron certainty now looked like a man scrambling to hold onto a crumbling wall. And the more he spoke, the more his authority withered. Emily felt the tension every day as she walked across the base. Some soldiers avoided her, unwilling to be caught in the storm. Others offered brief nods, subtle acknowledgments of respect. She returned each gesture with the same quiet composure. She never spoke of what had happened, never fueled the rumors, never demanded sympathy. Her silence was louder than any outcry. It unsettled those who watched because they expected anger, expected outrage. Instead, she carried herself with dignity, and that dignity spread like wildfire. The night before the hearing, she sat alone at her desk again, staring at the photograph of her parents taped to the wall. Her father's weathered face, her mother's tired but hopeful smile. She whispered into the quiet, "I hope I'm making you proud." And then, almost like a prayer, she added, "Give me strength to stand tomorrow." The hearing was held in a large room, its walls lined with flags and plaques. Officers filled the seats, their uniforms sharp, their faces stern. Emily walked in with her head high, her step steady, though her stomach twisted with nerves. Across the room sat Colonel Briggs. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. He glared at her, but she didn't return the look. She fixed her gaze forward, on the panel of officers who would decide what justice looked like. When it was her turn to speak, the room grew still. She rose, adjusted her jacket, and faced the panel. Her voice didn't tremble. She recounted every detail with precision, not exaggerating, not omitting. Her words cut sharper than any accusation because they were plain, simple, undeniable. She spoke not just of what had been done to her, but of what it meant for the soldiers who had seen it, for the institution they all served. Briggs shifted in his seat, muttering under his breath, but each word from Emily seemed to shrink him further. He had built his authority on fear, and fear was crumbling in the presence of truth. By the time she finished, The silence in the room was not disbelief. It was respect. The panel deliberated. It didn't take long. The verdict was unanimous. Colonel Briggs was relieved of his command, stripped of his rank, dishonorably discharged. The news rippled through the base like a shockwave. For years, soldiers had cowered under his authority. Now they watched him fall. And at the center of it all stood Emily Carter, not triumphant, not gloating, just steady, calm, resolute. When she walked out of that room, the sunlight struck her face. She blinked against it, inhaled deeply, and let it fill her lungs. She had not fought with fists or fury. She had fought with truth, and the base would never forget it. But victory didn't feel like celebration. That night in the solitude of her room, she felt both lighter and heavier. The weight of fear was gone, but in its place was a responsibility she hadn't expected. Soldiers looked at her differently now. Some with admiration, some with awe, some with expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. She wasn't just Emily anymore. She was the lieutenant who had stood unbroken, and that kind of respect was a burden as much as a blessing. Weeks passed. Life on the base moved forward as it always did. Orders were given, drills conducted, missions planned. Yet something had shifted. When Emily walked across the parade ground one morning, a group of soldiers stopped what they were doing. One by one, they raised their hands in salute, not out of obligation but out of honor. Her throat tightened. She returned the salute, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. That moment etched itself into her memory more deeply than the humiliation, more deeply than the hearing. Because in that silent exchange, she understood something vital. Respect wasn't handed down from rank or forced through fear. It was earned through dignity, through truth, through the courage to stand even when the world wanted you broken. Still, deep inside, she knew this wasn't the end of her battle. Briggs was gone, but the scars he left remained, not on her body but in her mind. In quiet hours when the barracks were dark, she still felt the cold water against her face, still heard the cruel words in her ears. She wondered if those memories would ever leave her. She wondered if the strength she had found in that moment was enough to carry her through the storms yet to come. Because storms always come, and somewhere in her bones she knew her true test had only just begun. Why did she still wake up gasping in the night? The barracks were quiet, the air still, yet Emily's heart pounded as if she were underwater again. She pressed her palms to her face, the memory too vivid to dismiss. It wasn't just the humiliation replaying, it was the silence that followed. The silence of witnesses, the silence of those who looked away. That silence haunted her more than the act itself. Days stretched into weeks, but the unease lingered. Respect now surrounded her, but it was heavy, complicated. Soldiers greeted her with nods, some with salutes sharper than before, but beneath their gestures was a question they didn't dare ask aloud. What will she do with the strength she's shown? They admired her, yes, but admiration had a price, and she felt its weight on her shoulders. She tried to carry it quietly. She dove into her work, threw herself into logistics, training schedules, and field readiness reports. Her office light often glowed late into the night, the sound of her pen scratching across paper like a metronome against her thoughts. Work became her shield, but not her cure. Sometimes, when she caught her reflection in the window, she saw not the lieutenant they respected, but the young woman still dripping from that bathroom, refusing to break. One evening, as she reviewed rosters, a knock at her door startled her. It was Sergeant Ramirez, a veteran with lines carved deep into his face and eyes that had seen too many tour overseas. He stood stiffly, but his voice was low. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted you to know, what you did, it mattered, more than you think." He hesitated, then added, "You gave us hope. Some of us were starting to believe nothing could ever change." Emily nodded, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. She wanted to tell him she didn't feel like a beacon, that most days she barely kept herself steady, but she just said, "Thank you, Sergeant." After he left, she sat in silence, staring at the door. His words warmed her, but they also deepened her unease. Hope was powerful, but dangerous. What if she failed to live up to it? Her chance to prove herself came sooner than she expected. A mission briefing appeared on her schedule, unexpected, high stakes. A reconnaissance unit needed an officer to lead a small detachment into a training exercise simulating an enemy incursion. Normally, such tasks went to captains, sometimes majors, but her name was on the orders. At first she thought it was a mistake. Then she realized it was a test. Someone higher up wanted to see if the lieutenant with the unbreakable story could command beyond paper and policy. The night before departure, Emily walked the perimeter of the base. The sky was wide and restless, the stars scattered like distant flares. She tried to steady her breathing, but doubt whispered again. Was she ready? She had led drills, supervised schedules, given briefings, but this was different. This was leadership in the field where hesitation carried consequences. She clenched her fists, reminded herself, dignity wasn't just about standing still. Sometimes it was about moving forward into the unknown. The next morning the unit gathered. 10 soldiers stood in formation, rifles slung, eyes sharp. Some were young, barely older than she was. Others bore the calm of veterans who had survived too much to be rattled by another exercise. They looked at her, waiting, for orders, for confidence, for proof that she belonged in front of them. Her voice carried steady as she outlined the plan, clear, concise, without flourish. She met their eyes one by one, grounding herself in their trust. Then they moved out. The exercise unfolded across a stretch of forested terrain, the air thick with pine and silence. Every step felt louder than it was, every snap of a twig like a warning. Emily led from the front, her senses sharpened, her doubts pushed into the background. She remembered her instructor's words. Leaders don't command from the back. They walk with their soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, risk to risk. Hours passed in tension. When the simulated ambush came, paint rounds cracking from the trees, soldiers shouting, Emily reacted without hesitation. She ordered cover, flanked left, directed fire with clarity that surprised even herself. Her soldiers followed, swift and precise. When the dust settled, they emerged with fewer casualties than expected. It wasn't flawless, but it was solid. More importantly, it was proof she could lead in more than name. That night back at the base, the soldiers gathered around the mess hall table. Conversation flowed easier than usual, laughter breaking through the usual guarded tones. One of the younger privates raised his cup toward her. "To Lieutenant Carter," he said, "the one who walks the talk." The others chuckled, some murmured agreement. Emily smiled faintly, though her chest ached with conflicting emotions. Pride, yes. Relief. But also the unshakable thought, this was just one battle in a war that had no clear end. Because even as she earned their trust, she knew the military was larger than one base, one mission, one act of defiance. There would always be another Briggs somewhere, another shadow to face, another silence to break. Later, alone in her room, she sat by the window, the moonlight casting pale silver across her desk. She thought again of her parents, her father's quiet strength, her mother's endless endurance. She whispered into the night, "I'll keep going, no matter what they throw at me." Her reflection in the glass stared back, resolute, haunted, but unbroken. She didn't know then what lay ahead, that her name would echo beyond this base, that the test of her dignity was far from over. She only knew one thing for certain: storms were coming, and this time she would meet them head-on. Why did the air feel different that morning? The sun was the same, the flag still cracked against the wind, yet something in the base hummed with anticipation. Emily noticed it as soon as she stepped onto the parade ground. Soldiers moved brisker, conversations clipped, gear checked twice instead of once. Orders had come down, her unit was being deployed. Her heart jolted at the news. Part of her had waited for this moment, longed for it even. Training exercises, logistics briefings, endless paperwork, all of it led here to the reality of a mission overseas. Yet with the surge of adrenaline came the shadow of doubt. Was she ready, truly ready? Respect on base was one thing. Respect in the field, where mistakes carried blood instead of embarrassment, was another. That evening she sat at her desk staring at the orders, the ink crisp and final. Deployment to a conflict zone. Reconnaissance and support operations. Not the kind of mission that made headlines, but dangerous enough to test every ounce of her resolve. She folded the paper carefully, placed it in her drawer, and whispered a quiet promise into the stillness. I will not falter, not when they're watching, not when it matters most. The days that followed blurred with preparation. Weapons checks, medical drills, intelligence briefings. Emily walked through it all with a steady presence, though inside storms collided. She caught herself in moments of reflection, watching the young private tie his boots too tight, noticing the sergeant's quiet glance when her name was called in the roster. She thought of Briggs then, not with anger but with clarity. His way had been fear. Hers would not be. She would lead with something different, something that couldn't be drowned in a basin of water. The flight overseas was long, heavy with silence. Soldiers dozed with heads against rattling windows, rifles strapped close to their chests. Emily sat upright, eyes fixed ahead. She thought of her parents again, her mother's last letter folded neatly in her breast pocket. She hadn't told them everything. She hadn't told them about Briggs, about the hearing, about the respect that now shadowed her every step. She didn't want them to carry that weight. Instead, she wrote of duty, of pride, of the honor of serving. Some truths, she decided, were hers alone to bear. When the aircraft landed and the ramp lowered, heat slammed into her chest like a furnace. The air smelled of dust and diesel. The landscape stretched wide and unforgiving, a palette of browns and grays broken only by the jagged line of distant mountains. Soldiers marched down the ramp, boots crunching against gravel, eyes narrowing against the glare. Emily stepped onto foreign soil, her lungs filling with air that felt heavier, thicker, than anything she had known back home. The base overseas was smaller, rougher. Tents flapped against the wind, generators hummed endlessly, and the constant thud of helicopters overhead reminded them all they weren't in training anymore. Every soldier's face carried the same knowledge. Here, mistakes weren't forgiven. Here, every choice mattered. Emily's first briefing was held in a makeshift command tent. The map spread across the table was marked with red zones, circles of uncertainty, arrows pointing into terrain where friend and enemy blurred. She studied it carefully, memorizing distances, elevation lines, supply routes. Her job was clear: lead a reconnaissance patrol into contested territory, gather intelligence, and return without casualties. Simple in theory, complex in reality. She nodded when the orders were given, her expression steady, though her pulse quickened. This was it, the first step into the unknown. That night she lay on her cot, staring at the canvas ceiling above her. The camp outside murmured with distant laughter, the hiss of radios, the occasional rumble of armored vehicles. She turned Briggs' words over in her mind, "You don't belong here." For a fleeting second, doubt pricked her chest. Then she pushed it aside. She did belong here. Not because someone handed her the uniform, but because she had chosen it, fought for it, endured for it. She whispered into the dark, "I will walk through this. And I will not break." The patrol began before dawn. 10 soldiers again, the same number as the exercise, though the stakes were infinitely higher. They moved quietly through the terrain, weapons at the ready, boots sinking into the dusty earth. The horizon glowed faintly as the sun edged upward, casting long shadows across the ground. Emily led from the front, her eyes scanning constantly, ears tuned to every rustle, every shift of wind. The silence of the land was deceptive. It held dangers she couldn't yet see. Hours passed. Sweat trickled beneath her gear, her shoulders ached from the weight of her pack, but she pressed on. The soldiers behind her matched her pace, their trust evident in the way they followed without question. She remembered the private's toast back in the mess hall, "The one who walks the talk." It echoed in her chest now, a reminder of the responsibility she carried with each step. The first contact came without warning. A sharp crack in the distance, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. The unit dropped instantly, instinct driving them into cover. Emily's heart pounded, but her voice was steady as she directed movement. "Left flank cover, Ramirez, eyes on the ridge." Her commands were sharp, clear, no room for hesitation. Bullets snapped overhead, dust kicked up inches from her boots. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to think clearly. Fear could not command here. Only composure. Minutes stretched like hours. The firefight was brief but intense, ending as suddenly as it began. The enemy withdrew, shadows melting back into the hills. Emily scanned her soldiers, shaken but alive. One man had a graze along his arm, blood staining his sleeve, but he grinned through the pain. "Just a scratch, ma'am." Relief flooded her, but she didn't let it show. She gave the order to regroup, to press on. The mission wasn't over. By nightfall, the patrol returned to base. Dust-covered, weary, but intact. Emily filed her report with precision, outlining every movement, every engagement, every observation. The officers above her nodded, expressionless, but she caught the flicker in their eyes, the recognition that she had done more than complete a mission. She had proven something they hadn't expected, that dignity, composure, and resilience could lead in the field as surely as they had in the barracks. Back in her tent, Emily sat on her cot, unstrapping her gear slowly. Her hands trembled, though not from fear anymore, from release. She stared at her reflection in the small mirror hung from a hook. Dirt streaked her face, her hair plastered with sweat, her eyes burning with exhaustion. But beneath it all, she saw something new, not just survival, not just endurance. A quiet strength, sharper and steadier than before. She leaned forward, whispered to herself, "You do belong here." And for the first time, she truly believed it. Why did the laughter sound so strange that night? Around the fire pit inside the forward operating base, soldiers swapped stories, some funny, some grim, their voices blending with the crackle of flames. Emily sat among them, smiling faintly, but her heart wasn't in it. The sound of laughter here felt like rebellion against the silence that hung over everything else, the silence of danger, the silence of what waited beyond the wire. She wondered if they laughed to keep from breaking. Her patrol had earned her trust. The men and women she led respected her calm, her steady voice in firefights. Yet respect carried shadows. Some nights she caught them watching her, not with doubt but with expectation, waiting for her to set the tone, to reassure them that the chaos outside could be endured. And every time she met their eyes, she thought of Sergeant Ramirez's words, "You gave us hope." That hope felt heavier here than ever before. The missions came one after another. Reconnaissance at dawn, convoy security at dusk, endless hours in armored vehicles rolling across hostile ground. The land was harsh, relentless, a landscape where danger could rise from any shadow. Emily learned to read the terrain as if it were a language, an overturned cart too neatly placed, a patch of soil disturbed, a shepherd lingering too long on a ridge. She learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts learned to sharpen under pressure. But no training prepared her for the weight of silence after loss. It happened during a routine supply run. The convoy rolled through a narrow stretch of road hemmed by low hills. Emily rode in the lead vehicle, scanning the horizon. The explosion tore through the air without warning. Heat, dust, a roar that split her ears. The vehicle behind them was gone, swallowed in fire and smoke. Emily shouted orders, her throat raw, her heart racing. Soldiers scrambled, securing the perimeter, dragging the wounded from wreckage. The acrid smell of burning fuel seared her lungs. When the chaos subsided, two soldiers lay covered under tarps, names she knew, faces she had seen laughing hours earlier. Emily stood there, boots heavy in the dirt, the sounds around her muffled as though the world itself had gone underwater. She wanted to scream, but her voice would not come. Instead, she pressed her lips into a line, squared her shoulders, and gave the order to move out. The mission had to continue. The living had to move forward, even as the dead weighed on their hearts. That night she sat alone in her tent, the silence pressing down like a physical force. She stared at her hands, still stained faintly with soot, and felt something break inside her. She whispered their names under her breath, over and over, as if the repetition might bring them back. Her chest ached with guilt, though she knew she hadn't caused the explosion. She was the officer, and in her mind, that meant their lives had rested on her shoulders. Sleep didn't come. Instead, she found herself walking the perimeter long after midnight, the desert cold cutting into her skin. A young private on watch nodded to her, surprised. "Can't sleep either, ma'am?" he asked. Emily forced a thin smile, just checking the lines. She didn't tell him the truth, that every time she closed her eyes she saw fire, heard the explosion, smelled burning flesh. She didn't tell him the weight of command was crushing her chest. Leaders didn't confess. Leaders carried. The following day she gathered the unit. She spoke of duty, of resilience, of honoring the fallen by finishing what they had started. Her voice was steady, her posture unshakable. Inside, she felt like she was piecing herself together with fragments of glass. Yet when she saw the soldiers stand straighter, when she saw their eyes sharpen with focus, she knew she had given them what they needed: strength, even if it cost her the little she had left. But there was something she hadn't told them. Not yet. The guilt festered quietly, a wound she kept hidden. Each night she wrote letters she never sent, pages filled with apologies to families she hadn't met, promises she couldn't fulfill. She tore them up each morning, scattering the pieces into the trash, as if destroying the words would ease the burden. It never did. Weeks blurred together. Missions, losses, small victories. Emily carried the weight, adding layer after layer of silence to her soul. Sometimes, when she caught her reflection in a puddle after rain, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. Hardened, yes. Respected, yes. But the eyes were tired, older than her years. She wondered how much of herself would be left when this deployment ended. One evening, after returning from a grueling patrol, she found Sergeant Ramirez waiting outside her tent. His gaze was heavy, steady. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you can't keep it all in. Not out here. You break alone, you don't come back. Trust me, I've seen it." Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. The words she wanted to say, "I'm fine, I can handle it," died on her tongue. Instead, she just nodded. Ramirez studied her for a moment, then added, "We follow you because you don't flinch. Just don't forget, you're human too." That night she sat with those words, letting them pierce the armor she had built around herself. Maybe strength wasn't silence. Maybe strength was the courage to admit the weight, to let someone else see the cracks. She wasn't sure she was ready to share, but the thought stayed with her, a seed of truth buried deep. When the next mission came, she strapped on her gear with the same steady hands. But this time, as she looked at the faces of her soldiers, she didn't just see expectation. She saw their humanity, their fragility, their trust. And she made herself a new promise, not just to lead them with composure, but to carry them with honesty, however painful that honesty might be. She tightened her helmet, adjusted her rifle, and whispered to herself, "I will not carry this weight alone." The desert wind howled outside, carrying with it the promise of another trial, and Emily walked into it, knowing storms still waited, but no longer believing she had to weather them in silence. Why did the silence feel heavier than gunfire? Emily sat at the edge of the command tent, the lantern light flickering across maps and radio equipment. Her soldiers had returned from patrol hours ago, yet the air was tense, brittle. Something unspoken hung between them. She felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered, in the quick glances exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking. Respect had carried them this far, but respect was fragile, and in war, trust was everything. The fracture revealed itself in whispers. A report filed anonymously, accusing her of recklessness, of leading them into unnecessary danger. Emily's stomach clenched when she heard. She replayed the missions in her mind, every order, every decision. She hadn't been reckless. She had been cautious, deliberate, focused on bringing everyone home. But the accusation was there, lodged in official channels, and it carried a shadow she could not easily erase. That evening she called the squad together. The desert wind rattled the canvas walls as she stood before them. Her voice was steady, though her chest burned. "Someone believes I've failed you," she said simply. "I won't demand trust with words. I'll earn it the same way I always have, by walking with you step for step." She scanned their faces, some unreadable, some supportive, some wary. The silence stretched. Then Ramirez, steady as ever, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I've been under leaders who gamble with lives. You're not one of them." A murmur rippled through the squad, quiet but telling. The fracture had not healed, but the first stitch was made. Still, the doubt cut deep. Alone in her tent, Emily stared at the ceiling, the accusation replaying in her head. Betrayal stung more than enemy fire. Who had written it? Why? Was it fear? Resentment? Or simply the weight of loss turned outward, looking for somewhere to land? She clenched her fists, reminding herself, leadership was not about being liked. It was about being true, even when truth was questioned. The next mission came before trust could fully mend. Intelligence flagged a compound suspected of harboring insurgent supplies. Emily's unit was tasked with recon to confirm and extract without engagement. Simple orders on paper, but war never followed paper. As they approached under cover of night, the compound loomed dark, its walls jagged against the stars. Every instinct in Emily's chest screamed caution. She signaled a halt, scanning the silence. Then she saw it, too quiet, too still. A trap. She pulled them back, circling wide, setting a perimeter instead of pressing forward. Minutes later, the ground where they would have entered erupted in fire, detonations shattering the night. An ambush laid perfectly. Emily's chest heaved with both relief and fury. Had they gone forward, half the unit would have been lost. Instead, they remained in cover, alive, breathing. She radioed for support, eyes never leaving the smoke curling into the sky. Back at base, the truth came clear. The anonymous report had originated from within the squad. A young corporal, racked with fear after the convoy explosion, had filed it, convinced Emily's leadership would get them killed. He admitted it, trembling, eyes downcast. Emily listened in silence. Part of her wanted to shout, to let the sting of betrayal bleed into her voice. But she didn't. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder and said, "Fear doesn't make you weak. Staying silent about it does. But don't mistake fear for truth." He nodded, shame written across his face. And in that moment she saw the deeper wound. He hadn't wanted to betray her. He had wanted to survive. That night Emily sat by the perimeter wall, watching the desert stars burn cold above her. The betrayal still ached, but so did the lesson. Leadership wasn't about perfection. It was about standing steady when others faltered, about absorbing doubt and transforming it into resolve. She whispered into the night, "I will not let fear define us. Not theirs, not mine." And in the silence that followed, she understood something vital. The enemy wasn't always out there in the hills or behind the walls of compounds. Sometimes the enemy was doubt itself, and that battle, she realized, was the hardest of all. Why did the silence before dawn feel sharper than the crack of gunfire? Emily stood at the edge of the base, the desert stretching endless and cold before her. Her orders had come at midnight: lead a mission to extract a downed pilot deep inside contested territory. High risk, minimal support, the kind of mission where hesitation could be fatal and where every decision would etch itself into the lives of the soldiers who followed. Her heart pounded, but her face betrayed nothing. She checked her gear methodically: rifle, ammunition, water, maps, forcing her hands to move steady even as adrenaline surged. Around her the squad gathered, eyes shadowed by fatigue but sharpened by focus. They knew the stakes, they knew the risks, and they looked to her not just for orders but for strength. As the convoy rolled out, the desert wind howled against the armored vehicles. Emily sat near the front, scanning the horizon, every sense taut. She remembered Ramirez's warning: fear left unspoken could destroy them. So she leaned into the comms and spoke quietly, her voice calm. "We go together, we come back together, that's the mission." A pause. "That's always the mission." Silence followed, but it was steady silence, not brittle. They heard her, they believed her. Hours into the mission, the radio crackled with faint coordinates. The pilot's signal was weak, intermittent, but enough to guide them toward the mountains. The terrain grew harsher, the roads narrowing into rocky passes. Emily ordered the convoy to halt, signaling the rest on foot. Boots crunched against stone as they moved, weapons raised, eyes sweeping every shadow. The mountains loomed above them, jagged and watchful. The ambush came swift and brutal. Gunfire raked the rocks, echoing like thunder. Bullets snapped against stone, showering dust into the air. Emily dropped low, barking orders, directing fire, maneuvering her squad into cover. Her voice cut through chaos like a blade, steady, controlled. Inside, fear clawed at her chest, but she refused to let it surface. Not here, not now. They fought through the ridge, inch by inch, every movement a gamble. When they reached the clearing, they found him. The pilot, crouched behind a crumbled wall, blood streaking down his arm, eyes wide with exhaustion. Relief surged through Emily's chest, but she didn't let it distract her. "We've got you," she said firmly, hauling him to his feet. "Stay with us." His weight leaned heavy against her shoulder, but she bore it without flinching. The extraction was worse. The enemy pressed hard, shadows firing from every ridge. The squad staggered under the weight of resistance, but Emily held the line, her rifle cracking, her voice commanding. When one soldier faltered, she was there, steadying him with a hand and a sharp, "You're not done. Not here." When Ramirez took a hit to the leg, she hauled him behind cover, her arms burning, her throat raw from shouting. Every second stretched like an eternity. Finally, support arrived, helicopters slicing the sky, their rotors pounding like a second heartbeat. The squad pushed forward, covering each other step by step until they reached the extraction point. Dust and wind tore at their faces as they loaded onto the bird, dragging the wounded and the pilot aboard. Emily was the last to climb in, her chest heaving, her eyes scanning the ground one final time before pulling herself inside. As the helicopter lifted, the desert fell away beneath them. Emily sat pressed against the metal wall, the pilot slumped beside her, Ramirez pale but grinning through pain. Around her, the squad exhaled as one, the release of survival flooding through the cabin. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the rotors drown the chaos still echoing in her blood. Back at base, medics swarmed the wounded, the pilot whisked away on a stretcher. The squad dispersed slowly, exhaustion etched into their movements. Emily remained standing near the landing zone, her hands still trembling though she kept them folded tight behind her back. She had brought them home. All of them. But the cost lingered, the sight of bullets sparking against stone, the sound of her soldiers crying out, the weight of every decision pressing against her chest. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by her cot, staring at the floor, her body aching, her mind racing. She thought of Briggs again, of the humiliation that had once nearly broken her. She thought of the convoy explosion, of the betrayal in her ranks, of the soldiers lost and the soldiers saved. And she realized something with a clarity that stole her breath. Leadership wasn't about avoiding fear. It was about carrying it, facing it, walking with it through fire and silence alike. When dawn broke, she stepped outside, the desert light painting the sky in gold and crimson. Soldiers moved across the base, some limping, some laughing, all alive. Ramirez caught her eye across the yard, leaning on a crutch, and raised a hand in salute. Others followed. One by one, the squad straightened, lifting their hands not out of obligation but out of something deeper. Respect, gratitude, trust. Emily returned the salute, her eyes burning with unshed tears. And in that moment she understood, this wasn't just about survival. It was about legacy, about the kind of leader she would choose to be every day for as long as she wore the uniform. She whispered under her breath, barely audible, "I will not surrender, not now, not ever." Why did the silence of home feel louder than the noise of war? Emily stepped off the transport plane, boots hitting familiar soil, the air cooler, gentler than the desert wind she had breathed for months. Families gathered around her, arms open, voices cracking with relief. Yet she stood apart for a moment, scanning the crowd, her chest tight. She had dreamed of this, returning whole, bringing her soldiers back. But the quiet of peace carried its own weight. Her parents were waiting, her mother's arms wrapped around her first, trembling, clinging as though to let go would mean losing her again. Her father stood tall, eyes glassy, nodding once in the way men of his generation spoke more with silence than words. Emily smiled, but it was small, worn. They didn't know what she carried. She wasn't sure she could ever tell them. The days at home passed differently. No gunfire, no patrols, no sudden explosions. Just the hum of traffic, the warmth of kitchens, the weight of ordinary life. Yet Emily found herself restless. She walked the quiet streets at night, listening for sounds that weren't there. She woke from sleep with her heart pounding, her hands clenched, the memory of dust and fire still etched into her skin. Peace was harder than war in its own way because it left her alone with the ghosts. Still, there were moments of light, children waving at her uniform, strangers shaking her hand with quiet gratitude, and the letters, stacks of them, sent from soldiers she had led. Some simple, some long, each carrying the same message: "You gave us strength. You brought us home." She read them slowly, one by one, tears streaking down her face in the stillness of her room. Respect wasn't something she had demanded. It had grown, quietly like roots beneath soil, and it would outlast the noise of war. One afternoon, months later, she visited a military academy to speak to a group of cadets. They were young, eager, their uniforms crisp, their eyes bright with the kind of fire she had once carried. She told them stories, not of glory, not of medals, but of silence, of fear, of dignity. She spoke of the weight of command, of the cost of trust, of the courage it took not to shout but to stand steady when the world tried to break you. The room was silent when she finished, not from boredom but from reverence. And in their silence she felt something shift. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to them too, a thread in the fabric of what they would carry forward. Later, alone in her car, Emily stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Older now, lines etched where youth once smoothed. Stronger, though still scarred. She thought back to that day in the barracks, to the cold water, the humiliation, the voice inside her that had told her to endure. That single act of defiance had been the beginning, not the end. From it, everything else had unfolded: loss, loyalty, betrayal, survival, respect. She whispered to herself, "I never surrendered." And for the first time, she felt the truth settle into her bones. Dignity had been her weapon all along. Years later, her name would be spoken in hushed tones among recruits, her story passed down like a quiet legend. Not the story of a firefight or a medal, but the story of a young lieutenant who endured humiliation and turned it into strength, who faced war and carried her soldiers through. Some details would fade, some retold imperfectly, but the heart of it remained. They would say she stood unbroken. They would say she led with dignity. And they would be right. In the end, Emily Carter knew something that couldn't be taught in any classroom, couldn't be written in any manual. True strength wasn't in shouting commands or striking fear. True strength was silent, steady, unyielding. It was the courage to hold your head high when others tried to drag it down. It was the will to keep walking when every step hurt. It was the quiet fire that refused to go out, no matter how the storm raged. As she stood one evening, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon, she let the thought settle deep into her soul. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.